This meeting is being recorded.
Good evening. Welcome to our first Lewis Sky History Program of 2020. I'm Peggy McPhillips. I'm the president of Norfolk Historical Society, and I'm so happy to welcome you to the beginning of our 16th year of these programs. We had no idea that we would be able to sustain it for this long, but thanks to all of you, we have, and we've got more good programs to come. This evening's program might well be called Hampton Roads and the French Connection. It is about something that happened almost 200 years ago when the Marquis de Lafayette came back to America in 1824 and 1825 for a grand tour as the guest of the nation at the invitation of President James Monroe. Lafayette had been a hero of the American Revolution more than 40 years prior to that. And he came back as it's a goodwill tour and also to remind people of the price that had been paid for their freedom, how dear a cost it was. Our speaker this evening is Robert Kelly. Robert has been with us before. He is a graduate of Old Dominion University, an author, a historian, the director of the Gloucester County Museums. He is president of the Fort Monroe Historical Society, vice president of the American Friends of Lafayette, and he's going to be telling us tonight about Lafayette's visit to Fort Monroe and Hampton Roads, including Norfolk, in 1824. And he's going to give us a preview of things that the Friends of Lafayette, American Friends of Lafayette, have in store for us in 2024 and 25 when we commemorate the 200th anniversary of Lafayette's visit, which was a huge deal back then. They had bonfires and special dinners and galas and just welcomed him immensely when he was here. So Robert will tell us a little bit more about that. I won't spoil it for you. I will remind you that there is a chat feature on your screen and also a Q&A feature where anytime during the program you can write in questions that you have for Robert, and we will save them and throw them all at him at the end of the program, and he can answer them then. So welcome. We've got a really good number of people who have signed up for this evening's program. So let the festivities begin. Robert, I turn it over to you. Robert Kelly, ladies and gentlemen.
Well, Peggy, thank you so much. It's always great to be with the Norfolk Historical Society. I think this is the third time that I've had the honor and privilege to present to you. In the past, it's obviously been in person, and I would much rather be in person to see all of you. But this is certainly better than not meeting at all. So again, thank you, Peggy, and thank you to the Norfolk Historical Society for hosting me this evening. This is kind of interesting for me because I'm coming to you live from my home, which happens to be at Fort Monroe. So I'm speaking about Lafayette's visit to Fort Monroe in 1824, and I'm speaking about it from Fort Monroe. Just a few hundred yards from where a lot of these events that I'm going to be telling you about actually took place. So that's kind of cool for me to be here with you all, actually from my home. I have lived at Fort Monroe for about 6 years, and the home that my wife and I live in was built in 1875, so it wasn't here when Lafayette visited, but it's just a stone's throw from the parade ground where Lafayette was received when he visited the fort. So I do have a PowerPoint that I'm going to share with you all. So let me see if I can share my screen and get this ball rolling here. Let's see. Yeah. I think I'm going to stop that, and you should see my screen here. And I'm just going to trust that you all can see the PowerPoint. I'm hoping that you can. When I first decided to speak on this topic and to put this program together, I was originally thinking that I would speak about the entire 8 days that Lafayette visited the Tidewater region in 1824. But as I began to research and put the presentation together, I quickly realized that I would need a whole lot more than 45 minutes to talk about his visit. He was all over Hampton Roads and he did a lot of things and saw a lot of people. So I decided that I'd focus specifically on about a 24-hour period, October 24 and October 25, 1824, when Lafayette was at Fort Monroe. I'll also speak a little bit about Lafayette's connection to the French engineer who was responsible for the design of Fort Monroe, which remains the largest masonry fort in North America. One quick disclaimer before we dive right in. If you hear me say Fort Monroe, Old Point Comfort, or Point Comfort, it's all the same place, right here where I'm sitting. It's been known by different names in different time periods, but Fort Monroe, Old Point Comfort, and Point Comfort, it's all the same place. Let's dive in. Lafayette is a young man of royal birth with liberal politics and what Jefferson later called a canine appetite for fame. Someone said he was a statue in search of a pedestal, but he was intoxicated with and had a rather theoretical love of liberty. It was theoretical because liberty wasn't known to many Europeans. Lafayette was a great romantic and he fell in love with America, the concept of America that the French had. This wild new world where you could start the world over, to use Thomas Paine's phrase. Those are some words from historian Richard Norton Smith, and I just think they really kind of set the stage for our discussion this evening. Lafayette, the 19-year-old French aristocrat whom purchased his own ship and traveled to America to volunteer in the Continental Army, being wounded at the Battle of Brandywine. The 24-year-old who was on the field at Yorktown and had earned the reputation of being a fearless leader and one of George Washington's most trusted officers and devoted friend. The boy general that helped forge a critical alliance between France and the United States. The man who supported and advocated democracy and openly challenged America's founding fathers on tough topics such as slavery and emancipation. 20th century Lafayette biographer Martha Foote Crowe encapsulated his career succinctly as, quote, "The boy Cornwallis could not catch, the man Napoleon could not intimidate." Fast forward in antiquity when our Marquis was 77 years old and the Continental Army's last living general. At the invitation of President James Monroe, Lafayette arrived in America as guest of the nation in 1824. Lafayette's return to America lasted 13 months, during which time he visited all 24 states in the Union. He traveled an estimated 5,000 miles and was hosted by the cities of New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Washington. He was hosted by former presidents John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and James Madison, and by presidents James Monroe and John Quincy Adams, and even future president Andrew Jackson. He was accompanied by his only son, 45-year-old George Washington Lafayette, his secretary Auguste Levasseur, and his personal servant. Treated with immense admiration and reverence, Lafayette was given a hero's welcome everywhere he visited. Lavish parties, cotillions, concerts, parades, and speeches were a regular occurrence that celebrated his heroism, fame, and legacy. On one such occasion, when addressing and welcoming Lafayette in the New York Senate chamber on September 13, 1824, Mayor of Albany, Ambrose Spencer, proclaimed, quote, "Franklin, the wisest man of the age, pronounced you the most distinguished he ever knew. Washington, the illustrious hero of the New World, honored you with friendship the most sincere and with confidence the most unlimited." During the 43 years between the surrender at Yorktown and Lafayette's final return to America in 1824, He had managed to stay in close contact with many of the founding fathers, exchanging dozens, if not hundreds of letters with the likes of Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Hamilton, and Monroe. Lafayette's influence and engagement with American politics continued through the early 19th century and even became critically important to the development of the third system of American fortifications. Now, before you on this PowerPoint, you see a couple examples of invitations to dinners and grand arches that were erected to honor Lafayette when he would travel into different cities and towns. Medallions and pictures and all kinds of souvenirs were created. Ironically, many of the pictures and some of these souvenirs were actually made in England or Great Britain, which is kind of an ironic fact. But nevertheless, there were trinkets galore. And if you had an encounter with Lafayette and you happened to be wearing a glove, you saved that glove for your family. So it was just an amazing event. And people just came out by the thousands, by the hundreds of thousands to see Lafayette. Now, back to the third system fortifications. And how does Lafayette tie in to this? Well, the War of 1812 had demonstrated the vulnerability of the extensive coastline of the United States of the United States. The US government took measures to design effective fortifications to ensure that there was never a British invasion, such as that took place during the War of 1812, when the British sailed unopposed into the Chesapeake Bay, up the Potomac River, and burned Washington, for instance. The United States government, after the War of 1812, recognized that this could not be allowed to ever happen again. They also learned a critical lesson at Fort McHenry, where a strategically positioned fort was actually able to save a city and partially defeat a British fleet. So it was quickly decided after the War of 1812 that a system of fortifications would be developed along the coastline to ensure the future protection of the young United States. The United States Army engineers, they had minimal experience with large-scale fortifications. They'd never taken on a task like this. In communications with Lafayette, President Madison laments the need for experienced engineers. Lafayette recommends his friend, who was an experienced French engineer named Simon Bernard, for this important task. On November 11th, 1815, Lafayette writes to Madison that, quote, General Bernard has so eminently distinguished himself in the Corps of Engineers, and this would be in France, namely in the fortifications of Antwerp, that the Emperor Napoleon made him his aide-de-camp. In that capacity, he obtained more and more the respect and affection of all. Lafayette continues in this letter, speaking about Bernard, quote, his private character has been on every account an object of universal regard and applause. Lafayette concludes, quote, I am so sensible of the value of General Bernard that I will feel highly happy to hear his proposal has obtained your approbation. His proposal to come to the United States and help design this third system of fortifications. Pretty strong words and a pretty doggone good endorsement. If I were applying for a job, I would like to have Lafayette write those words about me. 1 year later, almost to the day, on November 16th, 1816, Bernard was appointed assistant engineer with the rank and pay of Brigadier General of United States Army Engineers by Secretary of War George Graham. Now you can imagine this didn't sit too well with some of these American engineers. A lot of these folks, a lot of these guys had hoped that they would have the opportunity to design this network of fortifications, and then all of a sudden, the president brings in this Frenchman. Now, Bernard spends the next 15 years in America designing not just forts, but also roads and canals. Remember, this is to be a network of fortifications. This is, you need the forts along the coastline, but in the case of an attack, you need to be able to shift troops and supplies up and down the coastline. So that's why canals and roads were also very important in this national defense plan. And Bernard was in charge of designing all of these things. Fort Monroe, the largest masonry fort in North America, is Bernard's masterpiece. Construction commenced in earnest in 1819, And by 1845, it was completed. Took a long, long time. There's some various dates on completion. 1845 is a pretty solid date. There's other dates in the 1830s. The point is, it took a long, long time. Now, I would actually contend that the fort was still under construction all the way up until the days of the Civil War, because we know that the Army engineers, even right before the Civil War, were tweaking some of the fortifications. But it took a long, long time, and it was a very, very large project. Excuse me. This is a wonderful drawing from the National Archives. And if you look to the left, I hope you all can see my mouse where this red circle is. That is actually Bernard's signature. And these other signatures are the other folks that were on the board of engineers. These were Army officers and Navy officers, just a group of very distinguished military folks that helped to design and plan these fortifications. In addition to Fort Monroe, Bernard designed Fort Adams, which is a wonderful fortification in Newport, Rhode Island. Fort Hamilton, Fort Macon, and Fort Morgan are just some of the other forts that Bernard designed. His service to America and his fortifications are a standing testament to Lafayette's sphere of influence in the defense and preservation of American freedom. Lafayette had a direct hand in bringing Simone Bernard to the United States. And I think that's important for us to remember. So back to the topic of the day, Lafayette at Fort Monroe in 1824. Wouldn't it make sense that Lafayette would desire to visit Fort Monroe, the fort designed by his colleague and the engineer he had personally recommended to President Madison? Well, of course. For those of us who are from southeastern Virginia, we may brag that Lafayette spent 8 days in the Tidewater region of Virginia from October 18th through the 25th of 1824. His visits to Williamsburg, Yorktown, Portsmouth, Norfolk, they're well documented and they're really interesting to review. However, his whereabouts on October 24th and October 25th are a little less well known. On Sunday afternoon, October 24th, 1824, Lafayette arrived here where I'm sitting, but also here where you're looking at on this drawing at Fort Monroe, where he was received with the highest military honors and given a tour of the fort. The general was escorted through Fort Monroe by Colonel Abraham Eustis, the commanding officer. This is the same gentleman that Fort Eustis is now named for. Later in that evening, Colonel Eustis received Lafayette at quarters number 1, where he partook of a, quote, handsome cotillion party and spent the evening. Now, I'd like to just stop for a quick second and talk about this drawing because I love maps and I love engineer plans. This is a drawing from the early 1830s, again from the National Archives. These drawings, they are about 3 or 4 feet wide. They are huge, they are in color, they are beautiful, and they show extreme detail of what was being constructed at Fort Monroe. Across the top, you can actually see several structures, some of which may look familiar. The 2 buildings towards the middle, one of those is Lee's quarters, known today as Lee's quarters, where Robert E. Lee lived in the 1830s. We see some barracks across the top. Along the left side of the engineer drawing, and I wish we could make them larger, you can actually see some cross sections of the casemates and of some of the bridges. Yes, Fort Monroe had a drawbridge. You can also see just some of the details along the right side of the construction of the wet ditch or moat, how the engineers were planning that to look. Just an amazing, it's just amazing detail. And I think this plan and others like it really speak to the brilliance of the engineers and also Bernard. This is a time obviously before computers and before calculators, and just the detail in which these folks could do their work is just amazing. Another feature I'd like to point out, and I'm hoping you all can see where my mouse is kind of on the northeastern side of the fort. This additional little fortification structure, this was known as the Redoubt. And this was actually an advanced fortification that was designed to assist with the land defense of Fort Monroe. One of my colleagues who may be on this call, John Weaver, is an expert with fortifications, and he's written several amazing books on fortifications. And he and I both love the redoubt. And unfortunately, it is no longer here, but you can actually walk out to that area of the fort and really get a sense of how that fortification structure protected the land approach. We always think of Fort Monroe as a coastal fort, which it is, but there was also there was a lot of detail used and applied to ensure that not only would it be protected from a assault from the sea, but an encroaching or advancing army would have a very difficult time attacking the fort. Again, we could look at this plan for hours. It just shows the detail and the expertise that Bernard and these other engineers brought to the table. Now, the next morning, so that would be Monday, October 25th, 1824, Lafayette received the troops and officers of Fort Monroe, and after taking breakfast with Colonel Eustis, he visited the adjacent fortifications of Castle Calhoun, known today as Fort Wool. Captain Rufus Baker, an Army engineer at Fort Monroe, described Lafayette's visit in a letter to his mother penned just a few days after the visit. Quote, General Lafayette visited our post and stayed all night with us. He reviewed our regiments, and he ate and he drank, and then he ate and he drank again. In fact, Mother, he eats like an alderman and always has a keen appetite for duplicate dinners, suppers, and breakfasts. And I'm told that he considers York River oysters that fill a tumbler as mere vegetables. This is just another example that we have of this legend, which is I believe fact, that Lafayette loved Virginia and York River oysters. He was documented as eating them here at Fort Monroe. The image on the right is a copy of the letter, a portion of which I just read. The two images on the left, I'd like to speak about them briefly. The image on the bottom, the photograph, that is quarters number 1 as it looks today. This is one of the oldest Army structures inside the fort. It's adjacent to the east gate, so it faces the Chesapeake Bay inside of the fort, inside the moated area. And you see how it looks today with porches. It's a federal style home, but we have these porches that were added in the 1880s and 1890s, which gives a little bit different look than how it would appeared when Lafayette saw it in 1824. The engineer drawing at the top is what quarters number 1 would have looked like when Lafayette visited in 1824. We see a single portico over the middle part of the approach to the home, and we see the structure off to the right, detached. The kitchen was detached from the building in 1824. It's still, even today, it's obviously a very stately, imposing structure. But in 1824, when Lafayette would have visited, it would have been really impressive. It was brand new, and it was pretty unique for an Army installation in the young United States. So it's pretty exciting that we have an engineer drawing to show what it would have looked like. We do have a couple photographs from the Civil War time period, but they don't really give us the nice straight on that this engineer drawing gives us. So so that's why I really enjoy that one drawing. Now, the fort had only been garrisoned 15 months prior to Lafayette's visit. It was still very much under construction. According to 1824 U.S. Army engineer drawings, the casemated cover face, or as folks locally call the water battery, on the east side of the fort had been completed, and the majority of the stone walls had been erected. However, the moat remained incomplete, the brick-faced casemates unfinished, only a handful of permanent buildings had been completed, and plans for a hospital had only recently been finalized. The parade ground, the area in the middle of the fort, the grassy area, had been leveled and graded only 2 weeks prior on October 6, 1824, in specific preparation for Lafayette's visit. Now, that's another interesting fact, that that we uncovered when I was doing some research in the National Archives, going through the engineer records, is how the date of leveling of the parade field corresponds almost directly with Lafayette's visit. It is not a stretch to say. In fact, it is fact that the parade field, the middle part of the fort, was leveled and basically prepared for Lafayette's visit. The Army didn't know exactly when he was going to come, but they had suspicions and they knew that he would likely come. And this would be the place where the troops would be reviewed and where Lafayette would be there, surrounded by the imposing walls. And the United States Army wanted this parade field to be leveled. Just prior, a couple weeks prior, it was mounds of dirt. It was a construction site. So I can just imagine how both enslaved laborers and United States Army soldiers would have been out there working feverishly to prepare this new fort to be seen and to be toured by Lafayette. Now, Lafayette would have had more than just a passing interest in the engineering of the fortifications. As discussed earlier, he had recommended the engineer Simon Bernard. Clearly, Bernard knew what he was doing. Here's what we see. Here's what Fort Monroe looks like almost 200 years later, after it was constructed. It's still a masterpiece, and it's one of the nation's newest national monuments. Again, if you can see my mouse, you can see the moat that surrounds the fort. Quarters number 1 is located in this section. The casemated cover face or water battery would have been in this section. I'm coming to you from right inside of here, right across from the flagpole. This is Mill Creek. This is the Chesapeake Bay. And this is Hampton. And again, you can see in this beautiful aerial image, just the large size that Fort Monroe is. 63 acres are within the moated area. The moat was designed to be 8 feet deep. Obviously, the idea there is a soldier carrying 30 or 40 or 50 pounds of gear, if attacking the fort, would hop into the moat while being shot at by cannon and howitzers and muskets and would sink to 8 feet and would never even have a chance to scale the 20-foot wall. So just an impregnable fortification. The redoubt that I mentioned earlier, actually, this is a good opportunity to show the redoubt would have been in this section over here. If you all are familiar with Fort Monroe, where the PX is, the 1980s Post Exchange is in this area over here. And this is where the redoubt would have been located. The whole idea of the redoubt was to protect this land approach, to protect the peninsula from the north. If soldiers were attacking on foot from the modern day Buckrow area of Hampton, for instance, and marching down this peninsula, they would be taking fire for a solid mile or so before they even reached the main fortification. So the redoubt would have been in this location, and it would have just been, it was a small fort in its own right. It's a real shame. It's a real shame that it's gone. Now, I also, I would neglect a fact if I did not mention that Lafayette also traveled out to Fort Calhoun, or what we know today as Fort Wool, Fort Monroe's sister, the fort that is in the middle of the Hampton Roads Harbor, near where all those cranes are for the tunnel construction project. That was also a fort designed by Simon Bernard, and the whole idea was these two forts would work together. Fort Wool was on the southern side of the Chesapeake Bay Channel. Fort Monroe was on the northern side of the channel, separated by, these two forts were separated by about 1 mile. The whole idea is if a enemy ship's coming into the harbor, it would have to run the gauntlet of these two fortifications, which were designed to house almost 400 guns apiece. So again, it just shows you the brilliance and logic that these engineers and that Simon Bernard employed. Now, today at Fort Monroe, we interpret over 400 years of history, from the Virginia Indians' initial use of the land all the way up until when the fort was deactivated as an Army installation in 2011. Thematically, we approach much of this history in the context of an arc of freedom, or an arc of history, an arc that focuses on 3 primary events. Event number 1 1619, the arrival of the first documented Africans to the English North American colonies took place at Point Comfort, or modern-day Fort Monroe. This event represents really the beginning of slavery in what becomes the United States of America. Another event, 1861, the Contraband Decision, when enslaved people, they seek refuge at Fort Monroe, and they are not returned to slavery, but instead are seized by the Union Army and declared contraband of war by General Benjamin Butler. By the end of the Civil War, over 10,000 formerly enslaved people had reached Freedom's Fortress, the name that it had earned during this time. The Contraband Decision represents the beginning of the end of slavery. And of course, in 2011, President Obama, his first national monument that he creates is Fort Monroe. And this really represents an arc of freedom from the beginning to the end, to the first African-American president in our nation recognizing that Fort Monroe is a national monument. Now, thematically, Lafayette fits perfectly within this Fort Monroe arc of freedom. I would like to share two passages with you, and there are many, many to choose from. But I've specifically chosen two passages, one from the 1780s, just after the Revolutionary War, and one from 1821, just prior to Lafayette coming to America. The first from 1786, in a letter from Lafayette to John Adams. And this is Lafayette speaking. In the cause of my Black brethren, I feel myself warmly interested and most decidedly side, so far as respects them, against the white part of mankind. Whatever be the complexion of the slave, it does not, in my opinion, alter the complexion of the crime which the enslaver commits, a crime much blacker than any African face. It is to me a matter of great anxiety and concern to find that this trade is sometimes perpetuated under the flag of liberty, our dear and noble stripes, to which virtue and glory have been constant standard bearers. So we begin to see this, that Lafayette's struggling with this issue of slavery. We know from looking back at his life, even before the American Revolution, he struggled with the issue of slavery. He realized it was wrong, and he was involved with several abolitionist groups. But I think it's very interesting that he really begins to wrestle with this issue of this Declaration of Independence, this war of independence, this war of freedom, yet the American government is involved in slavery. 1821, in a letter from Lafayette to Jefferson. Are you sure, my dear friend, that extending the principle of slavery to the new raised states is a method to facilitate the means of getting rid of it? I would have thought by spreading the prejudices, habits, and calculations of planters over a large surface, you rather increase the difficulties of final liberation. Was it not for the deplorable circumstances of Negro slavery in the Southern states? Not a word could be objected when we present American doctrines and constitutions as an example to old Europe. So again, 40 years later, Lafayette is still wrestling with this issue of slavery. And I think it's just, I'm always intrigued and inspired by the fact that Lafayette is penning these letters to our founding fathers, to these folks that we put on a pedestal, and we realize that they're not perfect. But Lafayette, he is in a position to actually, in some sense, call them out. And I just think there were not many people at this time, particularly foreigners, who would even dare to do this. And there's just some wonderful and very thought-provoking correspondence between folks like Lafayette and Adams and Lafayette and Jefferson about issues, about all kinds of issues, but particularly the issue of slavery. Now, this was a lifetime passion for Lafayette. The emancipation of slaves remained an abiding passion for Lafayette all the way until his death in 1834. As I mentioned earlier, as a young man, he eagerly enrolled in anti-slavery societies on both sides of the Atlantic. He took an active role in the French Society of the Friends of Blacks, formed in 1788 to promote the abolition of the slave trade. After the upheavals of the French Revolution, Lafayette returned to France from prison and exile in 1799, and he resumed his correspondence with British abolitionists and American statesmen on these issues, and began once again to follow the developments of anti-slavery movements in England, France, in the United States. It's something that he continues and he carries with him. It's a burden he bears because he realizes later in life that he helped support, that he was an integral part of this American Revolution, and this American young American nation is still dealing with and wrestling with slavery. We also have the courageous story of James Armistead Lafayette. This is another one of those connections which I just find fascinating, and it always interests me. James was born enslaved around the year 1748. At the onset of the Yorktown campaign in the spring of 1781, James was a servant for his owner, William Armistead of New Kent County. New Kent is about halfway between Williamsburg and Richmond. At the time, William Armistead served as state commissary of military supplies, and his position allowed his servant enslaved James to be on the front lines of war. As an enslaved person, James was able to pass between the lines, and he began serving as a double agent, spying for the Americans while pretending to spy for the British. After the war, the Marquis de Lafayette attested in writing to James's service, and the former spy petitioned the General Assembly for his freedom, which was granted in 1787. So James Armistead, he does all of these courageous things, supports the American cause, supports Lafayette. 1781 comes, Yorktown, the surrender, and James is re-enslaved, and he's enslaved until 1787. It is around this time, 1787, when he earns and finally gains his freedom. James took the surname Lafayette to honor the Marquis. Late in 1818, James Lafayette petitioned for and won a military pension. He lived on 40 acres of land and he purchased in New Kent, traveling to Richmond twice a year to collect his pension. Lafayette composed the text seen on the right in 1784 to memorialize his gratitude for the services rendered by James. In 1824, a Richmond artist, John Martin, created the broadside featuring a facsimile of Lafayette's text and a likeness of James Lafayette made from an earlier painting by the artist. Now, you all can't read that text, and I will read it to you. This is the text on the right beneath the image of James Armistead, and this was written by Lafayette in 1784. This was written by the Marquis de Lafayette in 1784. Quote, "This is to certify that the bearer by the name of James has done essential services to me while I had the honor to command in this state. His intelligences from the enemy's camp were industriously collected and faithfully delivered. He perfectly acquitted himself with some important commissions I gave him and appears to me entitled to every reward his situation can admit of. Done under my hand, Richmond, November 21, 1784, Lafayette." Again, this precarious, difficult situation where a formerly enslaved person sacrifices and fights for the American cause, yet at the end of the war, he is re-enslaved and not recognized for his service. Now, there is one more amazing twist to this story. When the Marquis visited Richmond in 1824, the following sentence was recorded in the Richmond Inquirer newspaper on October 29, 1824, just 4 days after Lafayette was at Fort Monroe. Here's what was written in the newspaper. Quote, "A black man even, who had rendered him services by way of information as a spy, for which he was liberated by the state, was recognized by him in the crowd, called to him by name, and taken into his embrace." James Armistead Lafayette and the Marquis de Lafayette saw one another in a crowd in Richmond in 1824. This was 40 years after the Revolution. And I think it's important when you look at the newspaper, and again, it's just one source, but the fourth word of the sentence, "a black man even." I think that's an important word because again, it just shows the humanity of Lafayette. That one singular word, I think, gives us insight into the man, the type of man that the Marquis de Lafayette was, that even a black man in 1824 could have this moment, this embrace with Lafayette. James Armistead Lafayette died in Baltimore just a few years later in 1830. When the Marquis de Lafayette returned to France in 1825, he was known as the hero of two worlds. There's many, many examples of how we recognize and pay homage to him. This is a really interesting example. This happens to be the deed of gift from the Statue of Liberty. And who should appear at the top left but our Marquis Lafayette? This was a gift from France as a souvenir of the unalterable friendship of the two nations. And who shall they choose to sit across the top of this deed of gift but Lafayette? When Lafayette died in Paris on May 20th, 1834, he had few followers left. His biggest influence was as a living symbol of friendship between France and America. And again, I firmly believe that that Fort Monroe is, again, just another one of these examples of Lafayette's influence on American prosperity, freedom, liberty. And then again, the engineer, his friend, Simon Bernard, is just another person we often overlook that has a considerable role in our early nation. Now, I'd like to take a few minutes here at the end to talk a little bit about an organization which I'm very proud to be a part of, the American Friends of Lafayette. I've been involved with the AFL, as we call it for short, for almost 7 years, and I've served as one of the vice presidents since 2019. Our organization was founded in 1932, and today we have nearly 500 members across the United States. We also have about 24 members in France. You can see in front of you some of our mission statement ideals. For instance, we're an organization aware of the ideals of this great French visionary leader, the inspirational quality of his remarkable character, his contributions to our own struggle for liberty, and his ceaseless efforts to forge an eternal bond of friendship between the United States and France. We strive to foster and promote this friendship by ways of continual research into the history, and we believe in preservation and education. Members assist in reaching our goals by attending annual meetings, hosting lectures such as this one, donating books, erecting statues, attending the annual Yorktown Victory Celebration, and related events. I think most importantly, we are a diverse group of people who enjoy learning, teaching, and giving back to society, and we like to have fun. Here are a few photographs, and I realize they're small, but here's a few photographs from a few of our recent events. Here in the upper left, you see some statues. The AFL was instrumental in erecting 2 statues on the Yorktown waterfront. The first being Lafayette, kind of right there. You can't really see him too well, but he's there. And the second was Rochambeau, a topic of another discussion in the future. But we raised money and worked with partner groups to erect these 2 statues along with an interpretive panel. Why? To educate the future generations about these important folks. While other organizations and folks are tearing statues down, we believe it's an important time to put statues up to educate and to memorialize and to commemorate folks such as Lafayette. The picture in the middle, this is one of our most recent annual meetings in Williamsburg, Virginia. We travel across the United States to Lafayette affiliated sites for an annual meeting each June, and we spend 4 or 5 or 6 days just immersed in history. We get to visit Lafayette related sites, often that are in private hands. So it's a wonderful opportunity to visit estates and homes and properties that Lafayette may have visited, to see artifacts that Lafayette may have held or owned, and to actually really be immersed in his in the history of his life. On the upper right here, another important part of our mission is education. And this is a dear friend of mine and the COO of our organization, Chuck Schwam, in a classroom. We try to do outreach, and it's been difficult with COVID, but we try to do outreach programs where we actually get into the classrooms to talk to young people and students about Lafayette and about these founding fathers. about James Armistead, about the relationship between Lafayette and Washington, all these other issues. Again, Lafayette's struggle and lifelong passion for dealing with slavery and the connections of James Armistead. It's just so important that students be introduced to these folks and to understand why people like Lafayette are important. The picture here, this is from a couple years ago when we were actually invited to visit the Executive Mansion by Governor McAuliffe. There is a Lafayette room in the Executive Mansion. He spent an evening there. He was entertained there. And it was just a wonderful treat to be welcomed to the mansion, to sit in Patrick Henry's corner chair and to visit the Lafayette room. That's an example of the types of cool outings that we get to experience. Here in the middle, this is my wife and I on the deck of the French frigate Lafayette. The French frigate Lafayette visited Norfolk 3 years ago, and I was just extremely honored to be invited to attend a reception there as a representative of the AFL. Those of you who are eagle-eyed may recognize this picture over here. This is when the group visited quarters number 1 a couple years ago. We got a behind-the-scenes tour of quarters number 1. This building's owned by the National Park Service, but we got to spend some time in the Lafayette room at that building. And the bottom 2 pictures, these pictures represent some of my favorite activities with the AFL. About a year ago, we became responsible for the care and maintenance of a French cemetery on the Yorktown battlefield. There are 50 French soldiers buried there, and each Yorktown Day on October 19th, there's a ceremony and a wreath laying. And a couple years ago, there was a wreath laying, and just the condition of the cemetery was just not what it should have been. And we took it upon ourselves to work with the National Park Service to actually become the stewards or caretakers for this French cemetery. So a couple times each year, we go out there and we clean up the leaves, we pick up trash, and we lay mulch, and we cut grass, and we just make sure that the cemetery is presented in a reverent and appropriate manner when folks visit. I was out there last week, actually, and it's just a wonderful sight. It's on one of the driving tour roads tucked into the Yorktown battlefield. It's one of the most serene places you'll ever visit. And each Yorktown Day, each October 19th, the first formal event of the morning is always a wreath laying at that cemetery. And it's one of the most moving and important experiences that our organization is involved with. And then in the bottom right, Lafayette Day in Virginia. Every March 14th is now Lafayette Day in Virginia. Our organization, the AFL, we were instrumental in ensuring that each March 14th is Lafayette Day. And this was taken a few years ago in the Capitol Rotunda. These are some students from Lafayette High School in Williamsburg who were part of the day, part of the wreath laying ceremony. And they recited some words for us in the Capitol. Each year we go to the Capitol and we have this ceremony. The bust in the back of behind the students is the famous Houdon bust of Lafayette. It's just an amazing artifact to see in an amazing place, the Virginia State Capitol. And we will be going there on March 14th this year for Lafayette Day. So it's a wonderful, wonderful experience. I'd like to add, we are really excited with our group to be commemorating 2024 and 2025. I've spent the last 40 minutes talking to you about Lafayette's return in 1824. Well, it just so happens we're approaching the bicentennial of this important event. And our organization, we have very ambitious plans. We have committees across the United States set up in different localities, and our goal is to commemorate his visits to towns and cities on the day which they actually took place. So for instance, when he visits Yorktown on October 19th, 1824, in addition to that being Surrender Day, we hope to have some amazing, impactful programs on that day to commemorate his visit in 1824. So you can find out more information online. That's our website at the bottom. But 2024 and 2025 is going to be, I think, a really big time for our organization, because we have an opportunity to commemorate this return, but it also really allows us to go full throttle into education. And that's why our organization exists. We're all fans of Lafayette, but we are doing a disservice if we're not educating future generations about Lafayette. So we really, personally, I view 2024 as kind of an opportunity for rebirth, if you will, of our organization, where we can become an educational powerhouse and really get across the United States, go across the country, and educate folks about Lafayette, about what American freedom means, and so on. I will say that Lafayette was invited to return to the United States when he was, because President Monroe feared that the population was beginning to lose appreciation and understanding of what the sacrifices were that led to a United States of America. That the generation of those who fought in the revolution were dying, and just the United States, that the citizenry of the United States were not appreciative of the sacrifices that those who fought in the revolution made. So Lafayette was the last major general, and he was the person that could really rejuvenate this American spirit and bring people back into the fold of recognizing the sacrifices and what it truly meant to be an American. And I think as we look at where we are in our nation now in 2022, I think we need Lafayette. I think we need to revisit the spirit of this man and to understand what he stood for and to celebrate what he stood for. I think our country is in a critical juncture, similarly to how it was when Lafayette visited in 1824, in the sense that we need to stop and reflect on where we've been and where we're going. So I think 2024 and 2025 is very timely, and I think it's going to be a great opportunity to kind of take a new, renewed look at Lafayette and really to have a better understanding of what he stands for. In closing, I would like to tell you briefly about my day job. As much as I love devoting time and energy to the American Friends of Lafayette as one of their officers, they don't pay me. It's a volunteer gig, which I am honored and humbled to do. I can be found Monday through Friday up in Gloucester County, Virginia, at my full-time position as Gloucester County's Museums Coordinator and Director of the Gloucester Museum of History. The museum you can see on the left, it's a pretty unique place. It's right on Main Street. It is in a 1770 tavern, brick tavern building, masonry tavern. You can see pictures on the left of the second floor where we had the original floors and so on. I live in an 1875 house and I go to work in a 1770 tavern. I mean, life just doesn't get any better than that for a history nerd. On the right, you see an example of the types of programs we've been doing since being at Gloucester, since being at the Museum of History for the last 2 years. I've been really working hard to update the museum, do new exhibits, but also bring really fun programming to the courthouse and to the court circle. So we've been doing programming, which I think some of you probably have attended in the past, and we do have a pretty strong living history program that we do a couple times each year. Here's a couple other photographs that you may recognize from Gloucester Courthouse, very historic place. The upper right is an 1870s jail. The bottom left is the 1766 courthouse, and the bottom right is a mid-19th century Freemasons Hall. All these buildings are just adjacent to the museum. So come see me in Gloucester. Come see me at Fort Monroe, and please, consider look up the American Friends of Lafayette if you're interested in what you heard about this evening. I hope you all learned a little bit about Lafayette and about Fort Monroe and about the American Friends of Lafayette. I've promised Peggy and the Norfolk Historical Society that I would be happy to come back later this year to tell you more about the exciting things that are going on up in Gloucester. There's a lot of wonderful history up in Gloucester County, which I'd love to share with you all. In the meantime, I'll leave you with this. At a civic dinner in Portsmouth, Virginia, to honor Lafayette in October of 1824. Dr. Robert Archer offered the following toast: patriotism and philanthropy, when combined in the same individual, he may be justly styled the noblest work of God. 8 years later, Dr. Archer became the head surgeon at Fort Monroe. It all comes full circle. Anyway, thank you so much for this opportunity to be with you all this evening. And please consider coming out to the museum. There's my contact information, rkelly@gloucesterva.info. That's my personal cell phone. If you have questions about the program or about the American Friends of Lafayette or Fort Monroe or anything else, please do not hesitate to reach out. I think I've got a couple minutes. If anybody has any questions, it was an honor. It was an honor being with you all this evening.
Robert, that was absolutely wonderful. Several people said how much they learned that was new, and these are people who are pretty well versed on Lafayette, so we all learned something new. Your friend John Weaver, who you mentioned, was indeed among us. He thanks you for the shout out. He also says that he has an article in the current issue of the Journal of Coast Defense about the land defenses at Fort Monroe. So anyone who wants to know a little more about that can look for the current issue of the Journal of Coast Defense. He also asks about the variance in the spelling of Lafayette's name, if it was La space Fayette or just all one word. Do you have anything to say about that, the spelling variance?
Of course, John would ask a
It's
tough
not an
question.
ongoing discussion between the two of you.
Well, and again, I don't have a answer for that one. I do know when looking, when you look through historic documents, you see the issue with the, with capitalization. Sometimes you also see spacing between the LA and then the Fayette. I don't have an answer to that question. I know John very well, and I will look that up. If I can't find the answer to it, I will find someone in our organization who does know the answer to that. As I may have shared, I can't remember if I was speaking with just you, Peggy, or with everyone. I do not speak French. And that is something with all my spare time that maybe as vice president of the AFL, I need to take up. But I'm sorry, John, I don't have an answer to that.
But John, he'll get back to you. So you just hang in there. And Robert, you have 2 years to learn French.
There you go.
That's plenty of time. Another participant reminds us that in speaking of Lafayette's determination to have the slaves freed, he had already bought a plantation, La Belle Gabrielle in Cayenne, Guiana, in 1785. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yes, this is a fascinating kind of episode. It's often referred to as the French Guiana experiment. Lafayette acquired land in present-day French Guiana on the coast of South America, and as you noted, he called it La Belle Gabrielle. Clove and cinnamon trees, grew in that area. It was a very tropical place along the coast of South America. It was an experiment, and Lafayette was experimenting with this idea of gradual emancipation. And 70 enslaved people were sent there after he had purchased the property. And these slaves, they were paid for their labor, and the sale of any slave was expressly forbidden. Schooling was provided, and the punishment for blacks was no more severe than that for the whites. So you actually had you had those of African descent working alongside those of Caucasian descent. Lafayette had hoped to show that the birth rate would rise and that infant mortality would decrease, and that under these more favorable conditions, that there would not be a need for a slave trade. Now, his actions were increasingly drawn to the unfolding revolutionary drama in France in 1789, and the running of the estate actually fell to his wife, Adrienne. She relished the role and corresponded frequently with the estate managers as well as with priests at a nearby seminary, who she asked to look after the religious welfare of the slaves. When Lafayette was imprisoned in 1792, his properties were unfortunately confiscated, and these poor enslaved folks were actually resold as, formerly enslaved folks were resold as slaves. I think it was an experiment with the idea of gradual emancipation. And, again, the French Revolution, unfortunately, kind of interrupted things, and the experiment wasn't able to really follow through. However, they were noble intentions. You can look at the correspondence and see that this was something that Lafayette was trying to do in an effort to demonstrate that that these folks could be freed, and that this institution of slavery did not need to remain. Yeah, it'd be a great topic for another talk, actually.
Oh, this is what we live for, is a continuation and another topic. So yeah, that would be so interesting. One person says that he understands that Lafayette might have changed the spelling of his name to distance himself from the nobility. So there's one theory for you.
I've heard that. I see another great question that I'd love to address about why is Fort Monroe sometimes called Fortress Monroe? This is
right.
That's a great question. The reason it was often referred to as a fortress early on, this was 1830s, and it you still actually hear it today, was because in Europe, fortresses were towns that were completely encircled by a wall. So you'd have a whole town that was encircled by a fortification or a fort wall. So that was what a fortress was. And by the 1830s and 1840s, there had been so much development, both U.S. Army development and private development, such as hotels and stores and other types of business, that folks began to refer to this place as a fortress because it literally was self-sufficient, and it had so many people working and living, and that became the name. The Army actually, I forget the exact year, I think it's in the 1830s, the Army actually comes out with an official document stating that in future, the site of Fort Monroe was to be referred to, the site of Fortress Monroe was to be referred to as Fort Monroe. So again, you do even have some infighting within the Army, but it was because the fort was so large, and it was basically an entire self-sufficient town in some sense.
I'd always wondered about that. Because you see it both ways. Can you say just a little bit, since we're the Norfolk Historical Society, about Lafayette's visit to Norfolk and how he was received here?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Well, just as everywhere that Lafayette went, there were dinners and dances. Unfortunately, a lot of the buildings and sites that Lafayette visited in Norfolk in 1824 are no longer standing. We know where these sites were, but as I'm sure a lot of folks in this group know, the Civil War and the burning of Norfolk and whatnot, and development over the years, a lot of these historic places that Lafayette would have visited are no longer standing. Thankfully, there is wonderful records there's wonderful written record, primarily in newspapers and also in Lafayette's secretary Levasseur's journal, which was translated into English by our president, Alan Hoffman. When you go through this journal, you can begin to glean some of the locations where where he would have visited. But again, we know dinners and parties and parties that would extend late into the evening. What always amazes me, and this is the case in Norfolk, but it goes on over and over again, are just the number of toasts after toast after toast to Lafayette, to Washington, to the French Alliance. I just imagine all the alcohol that must have been consumed as these folks were toasting. But we do have some great plans. In fact, there's a committee of the AFL that is being wrangled by Chris Melhuish in Norfolk to really try and memorialize and commemorate Lafayette's time in Norfolk and also Portsmouth. He doesn't spend much time in Portsmouth, but it's not to be overlooked either. I see a great question, Peggy, about James Armistead Lafayette, if he has any children, if there are any descendants bearing the Lafayette name. The American Friends of Lafayette, we've actually run into several folks claiming to be descendants of James Armistead. In fact, this past Yorktown Day, we get together each year in Yorktown, and we had some descendants at a gathering. Another person who's doing a lot of research on this is Stephen Seals of the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation. Stephen is a wonderful African-American interpreter and historian, and he actually portrays James Armistead for Colonial Williamsburg. And he's been doing a lot of research in New Kent County because he actually happens to live in New Kent. He's been doing a lot of research trying to locate descendants and also to learn more about James Armistead's family. We know that he gains his freedom, and then actually he has to purchase his wife and several of his children to free them from enslavement. But we do know I think I've been in a room with at least two different sets of folks claiming to be descendants. And I know that Stephen Seals at Colonial Williamsburg has met with at least one other branch of the family to actually begin some discussions. He's doing a lot of research about James Armistead Lafayette. Fascinating person, and who's part of this story.
Wow, that's another program, right?
It is.
There's also one, and we're international. We have at least one person who joined us from Britain. Thought I would point that out. I think that's great.
Yes, and also Peggy, definitely, I hope that everyone takes a look at some of the comments in the chat box. Pierre Leroux, he's a member of the AFL, and he's from France. He's written some wonderful comments, which kind of build on some of the things I was saying. And of course, there's just some other great comments over there that I would certainly encourage folks to look at. And I'll just say, I don't even begin to pretend to be a Lafayette scholar. The nuance, the background, just the amazing aspects of his life. It's something that you need to study for a lifetime. I'm particularly interested in different snippets of Lafayette and how he relates to things such as Fort Monroe. And again, I'm just very inspired by, I think, his humanity and just being someone who stands up for what is right and just so idealistic and just so brave, and just a lot of qualities that I think that are important to recognize. So I'm hoping that this discussion gets folks excited and gets us all to want to learn more about about a character from our history who's really a cool dude.
Well, I think so too. And I do encourage people to look into joining the American Friends of Lafayette. I joined, and you all send out what you call a newsletter, but it's more like a booklet. It's huge. It's 2 volumes, and it has just full of articles and just fascinating things. So I really encourage people you got a reminder from your president, Chuck Schwam, I think, about www.friendsoflafayette.org, which you also shared with us. So thank you. Thank you.
Absolutely. And again, I hope, if anyone has any questions, additional questions, definitely reach out to, you go to our website, friendsoflafayette.org. You can get in touch with us that way, or my email. Again, we're a group of people excited to just share more about this great individual.
Thank you so much. And we enjoyed the extended discussion and the program. And everybody have a great evening. I hope to see a lot of you back on February 9th, which will not be about Lafayette, but we will get some more Lafayette programs to you soon, because it seems to be a great interest. So thank you.
Peggy, I want to thank you
And then-
again, and it's
Hi.
great. It's great seeing a lot of friends here on this program. I wish everyone health and a happy new year. And Peggy, thank you again for having me.